In the spirit of Halloween, I knew I wanted to do a video shouting about how great World of Horror is. It's great, check out the video on it. But as with all things, I needed balance. I also needed to shout about how bad a horror game was too. And it was here that I ran into a problem. I couldn't think of any bad horror games that I'd played. I'd been disappointed by Fatal Frame 5, and Eternal Darkness is kinda clunky these days, but they also have a lot of good to them too. So it just didn't feel fair to pick on them. So I took to the internet. What are some of the worst horror games ever made, I asked. And it told me a few recurring names. The most recent Alone in the Dark, where you are neither alone nor in the dark. Lifeline, an experimenting voice command driven gameplay that worked about as well as you'd expect yelling at a virtual woman would work. The inherently broken Friday the 13th on the NES. And the infamous FMV titillation fest Night Trap. But while these were all good candidates, they were all fairly inaccessible or cost more to obtain than I was willing to spend. And then I saw another game. A game released during the late PS3 era, focused on a post-apocalyptic world that's fallen victim to a gruesome infection. In the game, you escort a young girl who's immune to the infection while trying to survive against zombies and homicidal humans, and I have no idea why you're showing footage of The Last of Us here, because that's a good game. An excellent one, in fact. I wouldn't be talking about that here. No, it turns out there's another escort a girl through the apocalypse game from this era, and its quality is inversely proportional to that of The Last of Us. And it's available for £2 from PlayStation Network, which is always a good sign. And I figured I can spare £2 for some YouTube content, let's take this game for a spin. And oh no, they weren't kidding. Here are 6 reasons why Amy, a horror game from 2012, is bad.
I'm so proud of you, Amy. You did it!
I knew I was in for a treat when I first loaded the game up, and my TV helpfully informed me it was now running in 576p. At first I was concerned because I've recently changed my setup around and thought I'd messed something up. But I checked a bunch of other games, realised the actual PS3 menu was in 1080p, and it clicked. Amy, a game from 2012, runs in 576p. To put this into perspective, Sonic CD, a game released in 1993 and remastered a full year before Amy released, runs in 1080p on the same system. That's why all this footage looks so grainy, and I apologise, it was completely out of my control. Not that I imagine the game would fare much better with a solid HD resolution, as for much of the gameplay I couldn't see what the hell I was doing. The lighting is barely there, every surface is some shade of dark brownish grey, so it all kind of melds together. The visual presentation of Amy is one of the most offensive things I've ever seen, and I'm pretty forgiving with visuals. But this grainy, dark and muddy mess of a game is one that I find offensive on many levels. It may be against the Geneva Convention? Uncharted 3 released a year before this, by the way, just so we're all aware.
I'm so proud of you, Amy. You did it!
Horror games haven't always had a good time with dialogue.
You were almost a Jill sandwich.
But the clunky awkwardness of early Resident Evil was charming, and the stilted phoned-in delivery of the first Silent Hill and Fatal Frame titles helped inadvertently create an eerie tension that made things feel even more off. But by 2012, we expected better. Dead Space had 2 games out by the time Amy arrived, and the acting in those games is top-notch, for example. It would only be a year before The Last of Us arrived and used the zombie apocalypse to rip people's hearts out with the dulcet tones of Ashley Johnson and Troy Baker. This is the dialogue from the opening of Amy.
A cold winter. I thought the planet was supposed to be heating up.
I think we have a few centuries before we'll need to be wearing shorts in December.
Do you know what this reminds me of? Garth Marenghi's Dark Place, a show created for Channel 4 in the UK, set in a haunted hospital and starring its writer, horror author Garth Marenghi, and was notorious for its terrible effects, bad acting, and atrocious dialogue.
Do you really buy this portal to hell deal?
I wouldn't say I buy it, Liz. Let's just say I'm window shopping.
It was also, in case this wasn't clear, not a real horror show, and was in fact a comedy show created by Matt Holness, the real identity of Garth Marenghi. They set out to make an intentionally bad show, with the meta-narrative of it being it was a show written and directed in the 80s by an egotistical, talentless hack. Like a Mary Sue fanfiction given flesh, if you will. You shouldn't be using it as inspiration for your actual horror game. The same weird tangents that feel like the author's worldview creeping in, dialogue that sounds like it was written by a malfunctioning AI, and lines that are supposed to be emotional, but land with zero emotional impact.
Ellen's cut off. We're cut off. There's infected zombies and trigger-happy soldiers everywhere. We're never going to... I'm sorry, Amy. I'm a little... overworked.
Excellent job. Certainly rivals fellow 2012 game The Walking Dead for emotionally impactful dialogue.
I'm so proud of you, Amy. You did it!
The story of Amy involves a woman named Lana who is out to protect the titular girl, who is a gifted and special child. Apparently there's an evil scientific organisation experimenting on her, I think, and she's considered incredibly important. So you know how in The Last of Us you escort Ellie around, who is often charming and likeable, and your interactions with her create a bond throughout the game? Well, imagine the exact opposite of that, and you have Amy, a girl so devoid of personality they made her canonically mute. She whimpers occasionally at the start of the game, reveals an affinity for demonic symbols on walls, and is immune to such a degree that she can create immunity for others in her vicinity, which is why Lana needs to keep her around. And that is her personality, it seems. She also has wonky AI that does whatever it feels like, as the Hold My Hand Amy button works roughly 10% of the time you press it. She will climb out of lockers you've hidden her in because she's gotten bored, and when you thank her for completing a task you've sent her to do, she will flash this horrible mannequin smile at you, which is quite frankly the only scary thing in the game. You might also be able to tell that her presence makes the entire game an escort mission. You know how much everyone loves escort missions? Imagine the worst one possible, and it's the whole game. You protecting this creepy, emotionless child. Great.
I'm so proud of you, Amy. You did it!
To generate horror, you need to create a sense of atmosphere, of darkness and fear, and a sense of eerie unpleasantness. It's a fine art to craft horror that truly gets under your skin. Or you could just chuck a panel off a wall and call it a day, because that's how Amy handles horror. Just sudden loud things. Absolutely terrifying. I will be up all night thinking about that. Gosh, what a shocker.
I'm so proud of you, Amy. You did it!
So, escort missions, right? Already not fun. Now imagine if every chapter of that game with the escort mission had a hyper-specific set of actions that you had to follow, or else you end up stuck at best or dead at worst. Now imagine you do this while moving at the speed of a snail in molasses, and some of the actions require you backtracking through the same tiny space to pad out the game's runtime. Oh, and also imagine there are basically no checkpoints. That's this game. Also, there are puzzles that are stretched out beyond what is logical. So there's a room with a key card you need to progress. You can send Amy into the room. Sensibly, it seems like you just send her in there, get her to grab the card, and come back out, right? Oh no. You send her in, and then you go the long way round, climb up a ladder, and arrive on a balcony above that room. Then you tell Amy to get on a lift in the room, call her up, switch places with her, get her to send you down, then you can grab the card, and then you repeat the whole process in reverse and meet up with her again downstairs because she is apparently incapable of climbing ladders. And then there's the DNA tracking puzzles, where you have to scan bodies to get a DNA sample to open a door. There are multiple bodies to scan, and only one of them has the sample you need, so you just have to wander around the whole level pointlessly scanning everything in sight until the game decides you've got the right body. It's not fun, challenging, or interesting, but it is absolutely everywhere. Look, horror games have some obtuse puzzles, but they're generally not this strict, bland, or tedious. Give me Silent Hill's Broken Piano any day.
I'm so proud of you, Amy. You did it!
Amy fails in many ways, but most of all, it just flat out fails as horror. There is no tension for the most part, not least because you're trying to figure out where you're going or what the game expects you to do most of the time. But also the threats hold no weight. Most enemies are dumb as bricks, with this soldier not only having obvious patrol routes, but he will also eventually just go and stand staring at this doorway forever after a certain point. Same goes for this ultra zombie who stood right next to me at one point, and he was completely oblivious to my presence. These zombie creatures are easily dispatched to a comical degree, And this guy here looks so goofy trying to crawl through some motion sensors that it just ends up being funny rather than scary. Not to mention that in this whole sequence I'm basically just waiting for him to arrive so I can smack him in the face. And while we're on the topic of motion sensors, these things are more obnoxious to walk through than tense, and when I discovered you could speed up the process by just flicking the stick at rapid speed to create this weird jittery walk, they became trivial. Oh, and there's also an infection mechanic that's supposed to add tension when you're away from Amy, as Lana gradually starts turning into a zombie. And to be fair to the game, the first time the infection creeps in, it is kind of spooky as you start hearing whispering voices and the screen starts going all red. And then when the same thing happens every single time you wander off from Amy for a set period of time, it just gets repetitive and boring. And that's not how you make things scary. I am honestly not sure what was going on with this game. It is a late-era PS3 game that feels like a PS2 game at best, with bizarre design choices, terrible graphics, and a story that does everything it can to just not involve the audience. Usually the worst games I've played to this point have had redeeming qualities, or at least have felt like they had a solid plan that just fell short because of budget or other issues. Amy is just a clunky mess in every way. It is one of the worst games I've ever played, but at least now, I appreciate every other game so much more. So I guess it does have a redeeming feature after all. Thank you for watching, and I hope you've enjoyed this video where I looked at Amy, a bad old horror game. If you enjoyed this video, give it a like and subscribe to the channel if you're not already. You can support the channel through Patreon. Some names will be on the screen soon. These are my lovely patrons. Thank you very much for your support. And there are some other videos on the channel that you can check out. I'm in the middle of a Halloween spooktacular, so I've got a bunch of videos on horror games going up at the moment, so if this interested you, check everything else out that came out this month, I guess. So, yeah, on that note, I will see you again very soon. Bye.